Now, I'm really into sport. I really like sport, basically any sport. And I watched a documentary last week. It was a sports documentary called The Four Falls of Buffalo. And it's about the professional American football team, the Buffalo Bills, and how they became the first team to play in 4 Super Bowls, and they also became the first team to lose 4 Super Bowls. Has everyone heard of the Super Bowl? Yep, ish, that's okay. It's like the grand final, it's the championship game in American football. And it was interesting watching the interviews with past players. The quarterback at the time, his name was Jim Kelly. And he said that at one stage, that perhaps losing the 4 Super Bowls was in a way preparation for the loss that was to come in his life. He lost his son Hunter, aged 8, due to Crab disease, a degenerative disease that targets the nervous system. Another player, Scott Norwood, who missed the field goal that would have won his team the game and their first ever field goal. He shared that in spite of missing the winning shot, the love that he felt from the city was overwhelming. Following their loss, the city of Buffalo had a big parade and a civic reception for the team. And even before the reception began, the crowd was chanting, "We want Scott, we want Scott." Instead of being angry at the man that could have won that game off his own boot, they showed him grace. And Norwood said on that day, "I know we're struggling with this right now. You know I am. But I know that I've never felt more loved than right now. We all realise the sun's going to come up tomorrow and we're going to start preparing this team the right way. We're going to be back. You can count on it. And I'm dedicating this next season to you, the fans of Buffalo." And as I watched this film, I was reminded that often we divide life into binary categories: winning and losing, being successful or failing. But life is much more nuanced than that. There is more going on beneath there's more going on beneath than what appears on the surface. That while the team was on the wrong side of the scoreboard 4 times in the most important game of that year, how they carried themselves following those losses was much more important. Life went on after the game, and that character and heart are more important than any game. And in Mark chapter 12, we see 3 groups of people seek to test Jesus. I don't think he was ever really tested, but that's what they were trying to do. The Pharisees and the Herodians, so they were Jews that were loyal to Herod, the Sadducees, and then finally he's questioned by one of the scribes. And if you have a look in chapter 12, I think the scribe was perhaps coming from the right place. He was seeking to understand. But the 2 other groups were definitely trying to trip Jesus up. And as I said, it's these final 3 verses of Mark chapter 12 where we find ourselves today. Let's read it. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. When a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions, for they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on." In that first verse, we read that Jesus was sitting down at the temple. Of course, he had all the answers, but I just wonder, was he worn out from the continual testing and hassling, the relentless pursuit of him by those different groups? Or perhaps he knew that what was going to happen was going to be a teachable moment for his disciples. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, there's more happening beneath than what appears on the surface. And Jesus, as he always does, he gets to the heart of the issue. So on the surface, this widow contributed 2 small coins. They called them mites, 2 teeny-weeny coins of minuscule monetary value. And in my reading, it said they were worth maybe 1/8 of a cent. So whoever was counting the temple offering that day would have barely noticed them. They would have barely moved the needle in terms of the total offerings for that day at the temple. But Jesus notices this widow, and he holds her up as an example of trusting him and an example of generosity. God cares so deeply about our hearts. And how do we know? We looked at this verse in our small group during the week. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life." Not secondly or thirdly, but above all else. Guard your heart. Protect your heart. Defend your heart. Shield your heart. Safeguard your heart. Preserve your heart. Secure your heart. Shelter your heart. Fortify your heart. Barricade your heart. For it is our heart that determines the course of our lives. In the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, most of us might be familiar with the story of David and Goliath. But before that even happens, God rejects Israel's king, King Saul, because he disobeys him. And I'm not going to get into why this morning. But in verse 16, God tells Samuel to go and anoint the new king of Israel. I love God. And I love, and sometimes I don't love, how he doesn't give us the whole picture. But he tells Samuel to go and find a man named Jesse, and that one of Jesse's sons he has chosen to be Israel's next king. Now, he doesn't say which one. That'd be too straightforward. So if I'm Jesse, I'm thinking, if one of my sons is going to be king, it would have to be the eldest. If not the eldest, the strongest. The one most likely to lead Israel into battle against her enemies. If not the strongest, the most handsome, or the smartest. It's got to be one of those, doesn't it? So Jesse presents Eliab to Samuel. And in verse 6 of chapter 16 we read, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. He took one look at him and he thought, golly gosh, this has got to be the guy. This is what Samuel's thinking. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height. I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. So Jesse tells his son Abinadab to walk in front of Samuel. And again, Samuel says, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. So Jesse gets a third son, Shemaiah. Samuel says, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. All of Jesse's sons, or so he thought, were presented to him. And I wonder what's going through Samuel's mind at this point. He finally asked Jesse, have you got any other sons? Oh, yeah, we do. The youngest one. He's out being a shepherd. And it seems that David wasn't even on the radar. So Jesse sends for him, and it says he was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. A real dreamboat. No, it doesn't say that, but I just added that in. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." David might not have been on anyone else's radar, but he was on God's. God looked into his heart and he saw that he was fit to lead his people. And later, David was called a man after God's own heart. God took someone who was seemingly insignificant, the youngest in his family, the shepherd boy, and he made him a king. And this is a principle demonstrated throughout the Bible, that God takes the weak and the lonely and he raises them up to be who they were created to be. And in the case of the widow and her 2 coins, she gave what she had and God amplified it to show us something of his nature and what he desires from each one of us. It's pretty cool, hey? In the 3 verses before the widow's offering, Jesus warns against the scribes. These are the teachers of the religious law. David Guzik in his commentary says, the scribes were the Bible scholars of Jesus' day. They were entrusted with preserving, learning, and teaching the Word of God. These were the men that the people should have been able to trust. But Jesus said instead, beware of these guys. And from verse 38 we read, beware of these teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honour in the synagogues and the head table at banquets. Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished. Guzik goes on to say, the scribes represented a complete contrast to the picture of how a disciple should be, as a servant, as a child, as one carrying their cross. Jesus said that we should notice what they do as well as what they say. The things that Jesus mentions, you will notice, they're all things on the surface. How they look, how they're greeted, where they're seated, making long prayers in public. They care more about their outward appearance rather than guarding their hearts. They care more about what's happening on the outside than what's flowing out from the inside. They care more about how they're perceived by people than they do about God, who sees straight through their outward appearance, through to their hearts and through to their character. In the parallel chapter in Matthew 23, Jesus says in verse 5 that everything they do is for people to see. Later in that same chapter, in verses 27 and 28, he goes even harder. He says, "Woe to you, you teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly, your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness." God is not really into people blowing their own trumpet. Earlier in Matthew, he even mentions a trumpet. He says, when you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and the streets to call attention to their charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. I don't know if you guys find this, but it's a challenge in this social media age to understand the true motives of people. Have you seen any of those videos where people like pay for someone else's groceries? Like they just tap on the card and it gets paid for and people are a bit like, what's going on here? Sometimes there's videos of where they buy a homeless person a pizza and they just happen to have someone filming it for when it happens. Sometimes they give away PlayStation 5s or briefcases full of cash. Do they genuinely want to help people, or are they just doing it for the likes and the follows? I saw a video where, last night, where someone was giving out Crocs to kids in an African country. And I was like, that's cool. Like, Crocs are really cool at the moment, but I'm sure, there's some head shakes, but I'm sure they would prefer food or shelter or hanging around and listening and understanding. So it's really hard to know the motives these days. And we're reminded that the Lord doesn't see things the way that we see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Jesus looked at the widow's heart, and he could see that she had given more than all the others who made contributions. And how is this possible when she only placed 2 tiny coins? Because it's not, as Wearsby says, about the portion, but rather the proportion. It's not about the portion, it's about the proportion. The others gave out of their abundance. She gave sacrificially. The offering wasn't about what it cost monetarily, but instead what the gift cost her and the spirit with which she gave it. So the widow's offering raises some questions for us. And I hope and pray that this story helps us better navigate not just our financial giving, but the giving of all our lives to Jesus. So the first question I want to ask is, do we trust God with the future, with our future? The widow trusted God with her future because she literally gave to the temple all that she had to live on, all that she had. So we can say things like, God is in control, God is sovereign, God will provide. But do we live like that? I know that often I don't. In our house, Em gets paid monthly. She works really hard and she is the main breadwinner. So we live like kings for about a week and a half, and then towards the end of the month, we are scraping around. We are moving what money we have left around so that we can pay bills and buy groceries and fill the car up. But God always provides. And I know there's been times where literally there's been $1 or $2 in the bank and the pay just comes in at just the right time. It shows up just when we need it the most. And of course, we can do a better job managing our finances, mainly me, in the first half of the month. Yet in spite of us, God graciously provides. Some churches really push tithing and giving in general. Tithing, if you're not familiar, is where you give 10% of your income to God. And often this is expressed as giving to your local church. And some Christians believe that tithing can be spread across different Christian organisations, including the local church. And as a family, we tithe to this church, and we feel pretty good about it sometimes. But J. Vernon McGee states, Some folk ask whether they should give a tenth to God. And listen to this question because it's a good one. My friend, how much do you keep for yourself? Some folk ask whether they should give a tenth to God. My friend, how much do we keep for ourselves? It's not how much you give to Him. You're not required to give a certain amount or a certain percentage. The question is, how much do you really love Him? The Lord is the one who watches how people give. It's not what they put in. The widow didn't give anything of great value, friend. I doubt that the treasurer paid much attention to it, as I said. But the Lord takes the 2 coppers of the widow and exchanges them for the gold of heaven. We might think that I'll give when I've got more money. I'll give when I've got X item paid off. I'll give when I've gotten all the things that I need for the house. But if you're not giving now, if you're not giving what you have now, will you give when you have more down the track? Luke 16:10 says, if you are faithful in the little things, you'll be faithful in the large ones. But if you are dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. Let's not compare our giving to other people's giving. We might think, they have the means to be generous. They can afford to give that much money away. Perhaps we look at others who have more time than us, who are able to serve the Lord where we can't. Those with financial means to go overseas or to support missionaries. But in the end, the widow had just 2 coins. She could have held on to them knowing that they wouldn't make much financial difference, knowing that others were giving far more significant amounts. But again, she gave what she had to live on. I want to finish with a story from 2 Kings chapter 4. And it's a story that we've been through before. It's about Elisha, the prophet, and the widow. The prophet Elisha is approached by a widow who tells him that her husband, who served him, is dead, and that a creditor has come along to take her 2 sons as slaves. Elisha asks her, what can I do to help? What does she have in the house? And she says that she has nothing. The only thing she has is a small container of olive oil. He sends her out, telling her to borrow all the empty jars she can from her friends and her neighbours. And when she returns, she is to close the door and fill up the jars one by one. The flask miraculously fills every single container and then stops flowing once that last container is filled up. And she's able to sell that olive oil to see off the creditors, and the remaining she is able to live off. So it's not about the amount. It's not about comparing ourselves to others. It's about bringing what we have. The widow brought the flask of oil. The widow in our story this morning gave the 2 small coins that she had. So church, friends, let's trust God with the future. Let's not compare our giving to others. Just bring what you have and give it to God. Your finances, your time, your gifts and your skills, your resources, all of you, everything. And if it's done with the right heart, God will bless all that we bring. Will you join me in prayer? Father, we thank you for the lessons from these widows who simply gave what they had. They trusted you. They presented to you what they had to bring, and you blessed it, Lord. You amplified it, you magnified it, more than they could even imagine, Lord. The fact that we're still telling this story here and now, what a blessing it is. So help us to do the same, God, to bring what we have, to trust you with the future, to not hold anything back, God. Help us to be a generous, trusting church. And we ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.